Welcome back to What Are We Talking About? I'm Ben Lewis. Every day we are bombarded with headlines, outrage, talking points designed to tell us what to think. But here we like to take a step back, ask questions, challenge the narrative, and examine the biggest stories in politics, culture, sports, and faith through a Christian conservative worldview. If you're tired of media spin and ready for honest conversation grounded in truth, common sense, and biblical principles, you're in the right place. This is What Are We Talking About? Let's get into it. Okay, have you guys seen this Vanessa Sivadge story? She was the whistleblower in Texas on the hospitals that were transing kids and billing it to state-paid Medicaid and whatnot. Ultimately, the hospital was found in the wrong and paid $10 million. Anyway, so there are stories that you disagree with. There are stories that make you disagree with the system. And then there are stories that make you ask a bigger question. How did we ever get here in the first place? Because somewhere along the way, our culture took one of the most basic truths imaginable, that boys are boys and girls are girls, and turned it into something controversial, something that they couldn't understand. And when people inside the medical system start questioning what was being done to children, some of them say they paid a serious price for speaking up to protect these kids. One of those people was Vanessa Sivadge. She was a pediatric nurse at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston, and her story involves pediatric gender medicine, allegations involving Medicaid billing, whistleblowers, the FBI, Congress, and eventually a massive settlement involving the hospital. So today I'm going to walk you through what happened, but more importantly, I want to ask this. What does this story tell us about medicine, children, truth, and what happens when an ideology becomes powerful enough that questioning it can put your career on the line? This is What Are We Talking About? Let's get into it. Okay, first off, we need to clear something up. Vanessa Sivadge was not a detransitioner who sued her doctors. I think some people read that and think that. She was a pediatric registered nurse who worked at Texas Children's Hospital. She began working there in 2018 and eventually worked in an outpatient clinic where she encountered children being treated for gender dysphoria. According to her later congressional testimony, she saw minors receiving things like puberty blockers and opposite sex hormones, and she became concerned. Not just because these kids were struggling with their identity, but because she believed some of them were dealing with other serious issues like mental health problems, trauma, psychological distress that weren't being addressed before medical interventions entered the picture, before they decided that they needed to trans these kids. And this is where I think, we as Christians especially need to be very careful about how we talk about this, because the kids aren't the enemy. A confused 13-year-old is not the enemy. A teenager struggling with his or her body because of trauma, because of something they dealt with, that's not the enemy. These are kids. They need people that are going to listen to them. They need patience. They need people that are going to help them and talk them through these crazy, terrible situations that they're dealing with. But the compassion doesn't require us to affirm everything someone believes about themselves. In fact, sometimes love requires exactly the opposite. I mean, even Ephesians 4:15 tells us, speak the truth in love. It doesn't give us permission to choose one or the other. Truth without love, that can become cruelty. But love without truth can become affirmation of something that ultimately causes harm. And we're commanded to give people both. So the controversy surrounding Texas Children's Hospital actually involved another whistleblower as well, Dr. Ethan Haim. Haim said that Texas Children's continued providing certain gender transition treatments to minors after the hospital had publicly indicated that it was stopping some of those treatments amid the changing legal environment in Texas. Information eventually made its way to a journalist named Christopher Rufo, and that led to a federal investigation. Haim was ultimately indicted over allegations involving accessing protected patient information. But here's an important part of this. The federal government eventually dismissed the case against him in January of 25. And while all that was unfolding, Vanessa Sivadge became another major figure in the controversy because she wasn't just questioning the medicine, she began raising questions about who was paying for it. So if you follow the money, you'll realize that Vanessa alleged that she encountered records suggesting that transition-related treatment was being paid through Texas Medicaid. That matters because Texas Medicaid had restrictions concerning coverage for gender transition treatment. Her allegation was that the diagnoses or billing codes were being used in ways and twisted that allowed Medicaid reimbursement for treatment that wouldn't have normally been covered. Now, let me be clear here. An allegation is not automatically proof, and a settlement is not the same thing as a jury returning a verdict saying the allegation was true, and that is important. But if we're going to criticize mainstream media for blurring the line between accusation and fact, when they're talking about somebody we support, then we can't blur that line when we're talking about the person and situation we oppose. Truth has to be the standard no matter whose side it helps. But Sivadge believed something improper was happening, and eventually she spoke up. Now, this is where this entire story gets even more crazy, even more concerning. According to her congressional testimony, 2 FBI agents came to her home in July of 2023. 2023 would, yes, still be the Biden administration, would still be, I believe Comey's still the director at that point. So, I mean, there you go. She says they were investigating the disclosure of information surrounding Texas children's. And according to her, the agents told her that they could make her life difficult. So they came to her house and threatened her. She also says they suggested that she wasn't safe at work. Now, why wouldn't she be safe at work? That's weird. Workplaces are typically safe places, and I guarantee if you go to Texas Children's Hospital, they have a sign somewhere that says this is a safe place. But think about the situation from her perspective. You're a pediatric nurse. You think something is wrong inside the hospital where you work. You have concerns involving children. You have concerns involving taxpayer-funded Medicaid. Another whistleblower is under federal investigation, and now federal FBI agents are standing at your door telling you that they can make your life difficult. So whether you agree with her on every detail or not, conservatives should understand why that raises serious questions about the relationship between government power and whistleblowers. I think it's a little different now, but I mean, you've always got to be careful. You've always got to keep your eyes open. Government institutions should never become tools for intimidating people just because their testimony is politically inconvenient. Okay, so in 2024, she publicly identified herself and began speaking openly about what she claimed she had witnessed. Texas Children's placed her on leave. Then, in August of 24, she was fired. She maintained that she was retaliated against because of her whistleblowing and because of her religious objections to participating in transition-related care. The hospital disputed the broader allegations surrounding its practices, but Sivadge didn't disappear. She kept talking, and eventually she took her story to Washington. In April of 25, Sivadge testified before Congress. She talked about the children she encountered. She talked about the treatments. She discussed her Medicaid concerns. She talked about the FBI coming to her home and threatening her. She even discussed losing her job based off of her religious beliefs. At this point in the story, it wasn't just simply about one hospital anymore. It had become part of a much, much bigger national debate. What exactly is gender-affirming care? What evidence supports these interventions in minors? How much authority should parents have? What happens when doctors or nurses object? What happens when someone inside the system says, I think we're doing something wrong? And maybe most importantly, are we allowed to ask those questions anymore? Can you even speak up? You got WNBA coaches that can't even say what a woman is, and they coach in the Women's National Basketball Association. You can't even speak up anymore because science that cannot tolerate questions isn't functioning like science. And medicine that becomes subordinate to ideology can become extremely dangerous. Okay, so fast forward to 2026. Texas Children's eventually reached a major settlement following investigations and litigation surrounding the issues. And among the most striking provisions reported from that agreement is the establishment of a dedicated program for people seeking help with detransition. Think about that for a second. People seeking help with detransition, they can go to any corner doctor's office and transition themselves. What support, what resources, what facilities are there out there actually for kids who transition before they were old enough to make that decision and now they want to detransition? Has anybody thought about that? For years, people who questioned medical transition, especially involving children, were dismissed as hateful, ignorant, anti-science. I'm doing quotation marks. Detransitioners themselves have sometimes said they felt ignored because of their experiences, and it complicated the preferred cultural narrative, and the doctors didn't want to be involved in detransitioning because of the stigma attached with that culturally, and they were just kind of left out by themselves. And now one of America's most prominent children's hospitals is being required under a settlement to provide care for people dealing with the consequences of previous transition treatment. Sivadge herself is also receiving substantial compensation connected to her whistleblower claims. I believe the numbers I saw were the hospital had to pay out $10 million, $2 million goes to Sivadge, and they also had to create that detransition location. So look, again, that doesn't mean a court sat down and ruled that every statement that she ever made was proven true. That's not what a settlement means, but it does mean that they were worried enough that a jury would find them at fault that they decided to settle. Okay? They were worried enough that they didn't want to go to court and plead the fifth 111 times. There were serious questions here, and those questions deserve answers. But here's what I think is, this is where it gets deeper than just the politics of it. Because Christians believe something different about human identity than modern progressive ideology does. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them." Our identity doesn't begin with our feelings. It doesn't begin with our desires. It doesn't begin with our sexuality. And it doesn't begin with what culture tells us we should become. Our identity becomes with our Creator. It begins with our Creator. Just because a little girl likes to play with dump trucks doesn't mean she needs to turn into a boy. Just because a boy likes to play with dolls doesn't mean he needs to turn into a girl. That's a toy decision. That's not a life decision. It's not a sexual decision. It doesn't mean Christians pretend gender dysphoria isn't real. It's real. The distress can be incredibly real. Confusion can be real. Depression can be real. Anxiety can be real. And the person experiencing those things, they deserve compassion. But we have to make an important distinction. Feelings can be real without every conclusion we draw from those feelings being true. Let me say that again. Feelings can be real without every conclusion we draw from those feelings being true. Every single human being experiences that reality. My emotions don't define objective truth. Your emotions don't define objective truth. Truth exists outside of us and our emotions. And from a Christian worldview, ultimately, truth originates with our Creator. This is also why I think the involvement of children changes this debate drastically. Kids can't get tattoos. They can't legally buy alcohol. They can't sign most contracts. They can't fight for our country. They can't drive a car until they're 16. We recognize throughout society that children and adolescents are still developing and sometimes make decisions differently than adults. So why would we suddenly pretend that questions involving their sex, identity, hormones, and potentially permanent physical consequences should be treated so differently? Why can a kid decide that at 8 years old, but you have to be 18, wait a minute, I'm old, 21 to buy cigarettes? I mean, if people buy cigarettes anymore, vapes, whatever they buy, okay? When a child is hurting, our responsibility shouldn't be how quickly can we affirm the solution that you've identified. It should actually be, why are you hurting? Let's talk about it. Let's investigate. Let's address the depression, the anxiety, the trauma, the bullying, the family problems. Let's give that child time to mature. And above all, let's make sure we're not making irreversible decisions in response to feelings that may change. That's not hatred, that's caution. And when kids are involved, caution isn't cruelty, caution is compassion. There's another lesson we learn here. We can't simply yell woke every time something happens and expect to persuade anyone. You're not going to. Guys, you're not going to. Just because you call somebody woke on Facebook doesn't mean they're going to listen to you. We have to make the argument. We have to make it accurately. If someone exaggerates Sivadge's story and says she proves something she didn't actually prove, critics can dismiss the entire story, and that's based off of exaggeration. So don't give somebody that opportunity. Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them what she alleged. Tell them what the hospital disputed. And tell them what happened to Dr. Haim. Tell them that his prosecution was dismissed. Tell them about Sivadge's congressional testimony. Tell them about the settlement. And then let people ask the obvious question. Why did it take whistleblowers risking their careers before anyone started seriously listening? Because ultimately, Vanessa Sivadge's story isn't the biggest story here. Texas Children's Hospital isn't even the biggest story. The bigger story is what happens to a society when identity becomes more important than biology, ideology becomes more important than medicine, and affirmation becomes more important than the truth. Christians can't respond to that by hating people. If you know a Christian that just hates everybody then you open up the Bible, okay? Christians don't hate people. We can't mock confused kids. We can't treat transgender people as political props. Every person involved in this conversation bears the image of God, every single one. They've all got something going on. I've talked to medical professionals. If there is a percentage out of 100 of well-adjusted people with no trauma that want to transition, that percentage has to be similar to the percentage of abortion due to rape and incest. It has to be. Everybody that I've talked to said it's always associated with a trauma. But because they bear the image of God, they're worthy of something better than the lies. They're worthy of truth. They're worthy of compassion. They're worthy of medicine that puts their long-term well-being ahead of political pressure, and children especially deserve adults willing to say, you don't have to make this decision today. You don't have to make this decision today. Your body isn't your enemy. Your creator didn't make a mistake. Your feelings don't make you worthless. And your struggle doesn't put you beyond the reach of Christ. Vanessa Sivadge believed something was happening inside Texas Children's Hospital that needed to be exposed. She spoke up. She says federal agents came to her home. She eventually she lost her job. She testified before Congress, and years later, remember this started in 2022, the institution she challenged entered into a significant settlement that included provisions addressing detransition care. You can debate individual facts, you can debate policy, you can debate what the appropriate medical response to gender dysphoria should be. We should have those debates, but there's one thing we should never be afraid to do, and that's ask the question. Because if a medical practice is sound, questions should strengthen the case for it. Ask Anthony Fauci. If a government policy is legitimate, scrutiny should strengthen it. Digging in should prove the point. And if something is true, investigation shouldn't threaten it. We're not commanded to follow whatever the culture decides is true this decade. We're commanded to follow Christ. Jesus said, John 8:32, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Not ideology, not politics, not affirmation, truth. And we can stand for that truth while still loving the people who disagree with us. In fact, we have to. Because speaking truth without love does not represent Christ, but neither does abandoning truth in the name of love. That's the balance we have to get right. Kids' lives and their well-being are counting on it. Thanks for hanging out today. If this episode made you think or challenged your perspective or gave you something worth talking about, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help grow the show. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube, follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, leave a rating or a review, and share this episode with your friends and family. That's honestly the biggest way you can help us get these conversations in front of more people. If you've got thoughts on today's topic or ideas for future episodes, drop them in the comments. I do read them, and there's a very good chance they'll end up on a future show. I'm Ben Lewis, and this has been What Are We Talking About? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.